So good evening tonight. My name is Rob Semper. I'm the Associate Executive Director here at the Exploratorium. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening, a celebration of Paul Doherty's life. On behalf of Ellen, his close associates here at the Exploratorium, we'd like to welcome all of you to this evening event. You know, Paul, when he came by a few months ago, before he passed, he talked to some of our staff here, and he said he's been thinking about his life, and he realized that he had a life that was very well lived. And he told us that that was the secret, and we should all emulate that. So tonight we're going to actually talk about a life very well lived. It was a life that had so many parts and features to it that many of you are involved with, that we actually have invited 10 of his friends and associates to come up here and talk about the work they did with Paul, working with him, and what it was like to have his life well lived with them. So my job is to introduce people and go with the flow tonight. So first person I want to introduce tonight is Chris Flink, the Exploratorium's Executive Director. Chris?
Hello. It is lovely seeing such a wonderful outpouring of friends here today. I'm first in the lineup, but I am by far not the most important to speak today. Having just completed my very first year as Executive Director, I'm extremely relatively new to a remarkable institution where so many of my colleagues count their time here, not in years, but in decades. I will not pretend to have known Paul nearly as long or as well as those who will follow me or most of you. I will, however, claim to have known Paul before I got here. But not really. I didn't meet Paul until I really got here. But in a strange sort of way, I think you all know Paul was a legend. Before I got here, my sister, who's a high school biology and chemistry teacher and who happened to have done time at the Teacher Institute for a summer program, spoke of this legend. She raved about this remarkable science teacher who inspired her. And I don't always listen to my only sibling, but I remember listening intently as she told me about this man. In addition, I watched countless science snack videos. Raise your hand if you've watched a science snack video in your life. I had a feeling that we might have some fans in the room, but there are many more not in this room or even in this state or on this continent. In those videos, I saw a remarkably inspired man, because the truth is, Paul stars in like most of them. And before I came here, I watched those videos with my children and often by myself, and I would pause and sometimes rewind and watch some more, and you'd see this sparkle in this person's eyes, those bright eyes, clearly loving every bit of it. And he was eloquent, and he was charming, and he was in love with what he was doing. And he made you believe and want to do it too. So much so, perhaps, that along with my sister's cajoling and some very charming potential new colleagues and those videos, I ended up here. And before I ever met Paul, I felt like I knew Paul. I knew his spirit. I thought I did, and he probably was slightly freaked out when he actually met me, and I acted like we were friends already. In a way, though, if you think about it, I had gotten to know Paul. I've gotten to know Paul before I got here through the work he loved and the people he touched. And so it wasn't weird in my eyes that when I got here I was ready to hug Paul, and I had to admit that he was part of the reason I actually was here. But I'm very, very grateful in addition to that, have had a year to have shared actually in his presence here at the Exploratorium. And as grateful as I am for that 1 year, I know there are many here grateful for decades. And I can feel that tonight, and I've been feeling it intensely here in the community. So, I suspect I'm not the only person gathered here today who thinks the energy and spirit of Paul Doherty is part of what they love about this place. And the two are inseparable. I believe it's true that you can know someone before you ever really meet them. I think you can also share in someone's spirit even after they have gone. Yes, I felt that I knew Paul before I even arrived here. And I think his spirit is forever part of this place. And I would ask my colleagues and others who support the institution in a variety of ways and have been part of building this remarkable place to continue to carry Paul's spirit forward in everything we do. I believe that if we do that, even those who never had the good fortune of getting to meet Paul in the flesh or work with Paul for even a year will get to know him through the work he loved and the people he touched, which is, of course, all of you. So if you have a glass, raise it. If you don't, imagine one. It'll be a science experiment. We'll make tinsel fly, we'll play with slinkies, and we'll never forget the spirit of Paul Doherty in this institution. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I have to move this down now. You know, Paul came here in 1986 to join the Nascent Teacher Institute. And his life and role in the Teacher Institute has been extraordinary. You're going to hear about that tonight. I want to bring to the podium here Linda Shore, who was director of the Teacher Institute for many of the years that Paul was working in there. Linda.
So I'm usually quite eloquent. And I need you to forgive me in advance if I'm not. This is not easy for me. I love you all, too. So Paul hired me in 1993. And he hired me in the same position he had had. He was a university teacher in residence when he was hired, and then he hired me. Quickly determined that I should be director of the Teacher Institute because he was a horrible administrator. And he saw in me somebody who could take the jobs that he hated to do so that he could do the job he loved to do, which was teach. So you're welcome. So what made Paul such a great teacher? Oh, before, I just want to point out, how many of you are Teacher Institute alumnus? So for those of you who don't know, we're a family. And it doesn't matter whether you're retired, it doesn't matter whether you're a new teacher. Paul and I always said that you never, ever leave the Teacher Institute even if you want to. Case in point. So what made Paul such a great teacher and such a great mentor for all the teachers, all of them that he worked with? So he loved physics. He loved physics. He loved physics so much that I remember he was sent to New York to be on the Today Show, to pitch an Exploratorium book. Oh, Today Show people. And I said, well, how did it go? And he said, you know, they picked me up in a limousine. Really? He said, yes, and you know what? In the limousine, there were 4 Victoria's Secret models. And I said, Paul, that's, what were they wearing? And I said, what did you talk about? Physics. That's how much he loved physics. But the one thing he loved more than physics was teaching. He loved teaching. I remember I would want him to do some administrative BS for me, and he would be with a teacher for hours. He could, and how many of you, I think many of the teachers in this room can remember, if you had a question, if you wanted something from Paul, if you were confused about something, he would stick with you until you got it. It didn't matter if it took 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, all day, even after a long day of teaching in the Teacher Institute, he would continue with a single teacher for as long as it took. And the other remarkable thing about him was not only was his knowledge infinite, but he was able to tailor explanations so that you got it. The explanation was tailored for you. And if you didn't get it the first time, he would change it and morph it. He was a maestro at this, fabulous at it. And the other thing that made him amazing in the Teacher Institute was that he loved teachers. He loved all of you so much. He would tell me, and in Exploratorium, forgive me for this, but he would say the one thing he cared about more than anything else working here was you, and working with you, and helping you. And I don't want that to make you sad. What I want you to think about is everything he taught you, and every way that he taught that you have taken on has been given to every single one of your students every single day that you work. And that's what he wanted more than anything. And so that legacy is being passed on from generation to generation to generation. So I want to leave you with, for the rest of you who weren't part of the Teacher Institute, I want to leave you with the 5 things he said over and over again, and I think they not only make you a fabulous scientist, a fabulous teacher, but they make you a fabulous human being. So listen to all 5. He always said, be a careful observer. Observe the world carefully, completely, appreciate every detail, and be very honest about your observations. Take it all in. The second, always be honest, that a scientist, and I think one of the buttons says it, a good scientist, a good person, is honest. 3, always ask anybody making a claim, how do you know that? What's the evidence? Moving on. It's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that. I'll tell you a secret that you probably know was Paul's way of saying, I'm not really sure I have the answer right now, so I'm going to say it's a little more complicated than that. But the truth is, the universe, your life, everything is really more complicated than they appear on the surface. There's no black and white. And it's okay, lastly, to say, I don't know. I think he loved not knowing because it was an opportunity to learn, and he loved to learn. It's okay to say, I don't know. And lastly, I'm going to talk to Paul directly myself, if it's okay. So I need to talk to Patio for a moment. So there's something Patio taught me. Paul taught me so much. He taught me about physics and how to be a good teacher. He even taught me how to be a good administrator by bad example. But I remember the first time I saw Patio was actually in Second Life. And he taught me at a time where I needed it more than anything to be true to yourself. To not be afraid of what people think or what people say, that your life is your life and there's only one. That has meant more to me, girlfriend, than I ever told you. And it's something, a legacy that I think is also really important for all of us to know. So, girlfriend, like I say to you in Second Life, when I see you, hugs, sweet dreams, and I'll see you again in the virtual world another time.
Thanks, Linda. Well, Paul was, of course, part of the Teacher Institute. He's also part of the Exploratorium family, and our Exploratorium family occurs here in the building, but also sometimes occurs out in the playa, out in the desert. And to bring up my next speaker is George Kogan, Chairman of the Board of the Exploratorium, to talk about his experiences with Paul. George.
I feel very honored, and Melissa said it's sort of odd that you're the one talking about Burning Man. But I do want to just start with a few reflections about Paul. My first salient memory of Paul was about 20 years ago when I joined the board. And it was Paul doing what we all did when we were kids with helium balloons, only with argon. Or it might have been sulfur hexafluoride, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's heavier than air, and so when you breathe it out, your voice gets really, really low. Except there's a little danger involved because the argon, or sulfur hexafluoride, is heavier than air. And so if you stay standing up, you're no longer going to absorb oxygen from the atmosphere, and so you have to bend over to let the argon go out of your lungs. And so that demonstration was just so memorable probably because of a little bit of danger involved. But like Linda, I remember Paul as being someone who just had so much joy about the world and about the phenomena in the world. He was one of the most observant and curious people that I've ever met. And I think he had an intellect to match. So if you wanted to discuss any topic, he was always there. Oftentimes the explanations were subtle. If he didn't know the answer, he would actually make you feel smart by exploring some options, and eventually you would come to a deeper understanding of what was going on. For me, Paul was the Exploratorium. He embodied everything that I think is wonderful about this place, about this culture. And I think he was probably the best explainer of scientific phenomena I've ever met. I mean, really by significant margin. I raised a bunch of money for the Exploratorium, and sometimes things didn't go very well, and when I was at a low, I would come to sort of tag behind Paul in one of the morning floor walks, either with the Teacher Institute or with the explainers, and that gave me a sense of purpose, and I would always come away with sort of a more joyous feeling because Paul had such a contagious optimism about him. So I've felt lucky that over the years I got to know Paul more and more. So Linda mentioned Second Life. Around 10 years ago, I heard that the Exploratorium was secretly creating a virtual Exploratorium in Second Life. And I thought that was really cool. And so one Sunday afternoon, I built an avatar, which was not actually that easy. And I went into Second Life, and I was just blown away. If you haven't been there, it's still there. I went this weekend. Patio Plasma and several of her colleagues at the Exploratorium built tons of exhibits, some of which are riffs on Exploratorium exhibits, but some of them can't even exist in the real world. They can only exist in the virtual world. So, for example, you can become a molecule and experience Brownian motion in the first person. It's totally cool. You can actually get on a comet and fly in a mathematically correct orbit around the sun. And Paul actually told me that he spent quite a long time making sure that the trajectory of the comet was actually the correct trajectory. To me, it just felt like this was an indication of how far and wide the culture of the Exploratorium could go. I think, the last thing that I saw in Second Life was Patio used to broadcast the eclipses there, and he actually even had a little mini Teacher Institute. And so I actually thought that the Teacher Institute could expand through an expansion of Second Life. But anyway, Patio had a female form, and that's really what I want to talk about. She also had a Facebook page once Facebook became a thing. And I don't really remember when I met Patio in the flesh, but when I did, I wasn't really, it didn't really have a huge impact on me because I knew her from these virtual worlds. I have to say that she dressed a little bit differently in real life than she did in Second Life, but she was still quite stylish. And I think I met her at an After Dark. In fact, she became a regular over the years at After Dark. And she even did floor demonstrations. I think many of you may have been here to see the science of nail polish, which was a big favorite. So once I was hanging out at an After Dark with Patio, and she told me that she was very careful where and when she came out. Maybe because I was the chairman of the board. She said she would never do this during the day at the Exploratorium when there were kids here. And somehow this made me both happy and sad. Happy because Paul was ever thoughtful about the risks that he took, but sad because maybe Patio didn't feel like she could always be herself. Patio was also a really important member of our Burning Man camp, the Mansonian Institute of Urban Studies. We run a museum. Those who know her from Burning Man know that she came out pretty fully there, although occasionally she came as Paul, and she actually did a bunch of Science of the Playa videos as Paul. But the tell is that Paul has red nail polish in those science snacks. But we learned from her how alkaline the dust is and why things won't grow there. We learned why the cracks in the playa are typically 120 degrees apart from one another, and a bunch of other things that were quite cool. She did everything at Burning Man. In fact, one day she came to our camp and she said she had just completed a complete tour of every street in Burning Man, which if you calculate it, is probably maybe 30 miles of bike riding, maybe even more. And she also surveyed all the artwork and brought back sort of highlights that we should go see. And she took great pleasure, just as Paul did, in explaining the science of things. So I remember so vividly, we participated in this huge sculpture that was called Embrace. And it got burned at the end of Burning Man, as some things do. And it was a huge conflagration, and these fire tornadoes were coming off the end of Embrace. And Patio noticed that the rotation of each vortex of the tornado went counterclockwise, then clockwise, then counterclockwise, then clockwise, and kind of explained to us all why that was happening. It was just a really cool moment. When I heard that Paul's cancer had returned in an aggressive form, I sent him a letter thanking him for the many blessings that he had given me. But most of all, I thanked him for letting me see his feminine side in the form of Patio and helping me in my own journey in becoming, as my daughter would say, just a little bit more woke. So Paul and Patio leave many legacies, as demonstrated by the number of people here and the number of memorials that have been had for him. There was a memorial in Second Life on August 26th, and he leaves an amazing series of experiences and exhibits there that you should all check out. We had a wonderful ceremony for him at Burning Man where we put pictures of him up at the temple. And of course here, I think Paul's mark on the Exploratorium will be forever felt through the programs he developed and the thousands of teachers and students that he touched. And I'm a better person for knowing both Paul and Patio. I hope everyone here will be just a little bit more curious and a little bit more comfortable being who you are to echo what Linda said as a result of knowing Paul and Patty O. Thank you.
Well, we've talked a little bit about Paul doing Teacher Institute work and teaching, and of course he was involved in exhibit building here. But another whole side of Paul had to do with writing and books and creating great experiences on paper. And so to talk about that, we have Pat Murphy here to talk about working with Paul. Pat.
Hi there. I worked with Paul. I met him here at the Exploratorium, and for more than 30 years we worked together on projects, books, articles. For 20 years we wrote a column for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and most recently we wrote a science fiction story together, which was a first for Paul. And it was published in Best Science Fiction of the Year, which I told Paul was not half bad for your first story. And I'm sure everyone here knows that Paul was an amazing communicator. He brought the same enthusiasm to his writing that he brought to everything he did. It was an exploration, it was an adventure. And he knew in his heart that everything could be explored, everything was interesting, and everything could be written about. And in writing, as in so many things, Paul's approach was be curious, be open, be fearless. That one got me in trouble sometimes. The very first column we wrote for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction was about gravity, and Paul suggested that it might be a good idea if I went on the drop zone, which is a ride at Great America where they haul you up an 80-meter tower and then drop you. And he explained all the great things you could observe, like the ground approaching you at an accelerating rate of speed, and you could watch a penny as you fell and see how it fell, and you could get in touch with the sensation in your intestines as they relaxed in free fall. So it is a testament to Paul's powers of persuasion and his enthusiasm that I went and rode on the drop zone, and I observed that I closed my eyes and started swearing as soon as they strapped me in. And I went up to the top and I swore a blue streak and screamed all the way down. And I did experience interesting sensations in my intestines, but I wouldn't describe them as relaxed. The man who's now my husband went with me and did observe what the penny did, but I didn't see any of it. But, you know, it was like Paul could convince you to do wonderful things. And he loved so much what he was doing, and he loved to share that love with everyone around him. And all of that made him a fabulous collaborator. And what stood out for me above everything else was his ability to answer questions. Address questions. And you know those Victoria's Secret models in the limousine? I heard that story too. And the thing was, they asked him questions. That was why they talked about physics, because they asked him questions about the moon and whether or not the moon we saw was in the same phase as the moon the people on the other side of the Earth were seeing. And, well, you know, of course, you talk about the moon the whole time you're in the limo. Anyway, one of the things that made Paul so remarkable about answering questions was, as Linda said, his ability to pitch his answer to the person who was asking the question. And there's many people who can answer questions, but I've never found anyone else who can zero in on what you need to know, what level you can understand. And we talked a lot about his approach, and I love it. His approach was to always begin with the simplest possible model that answers a question or explains an experiment. And then you always remember that there's that asterisk, and the asterisk is the invisible footnote that says, but it's actually more complicated than that. And Paul was also great at saying, I don't know, and let's find out. And it was always an enormous joy to work with Paul to figure out a path through complication to clarity. It usually involved writing on the back of whatever piece of paper was at hand and drawing little pictures and coming up with some analogies and building on each other ideas and asking questions, always asking questions. Now, before I met Paul, I'm a scientist and a journalist, and I thought I was pretty good at asking questions. But working with Paul, I got really good at asking questions because he was so good and so enthusiastic and so generous about answering them that I got better at doing what I like to do, which was ask questions. I think Paul made the people around him better at whatever they did. And like so many people here, I really miss Paul, and I'm going to keep missing him every time I think of something I want to share with him. I don't know what happens to people when we pass away, but I do think that after we die, part of us lives on in the form of all the people we have touched. And Paul is still here in all of us. And that's what I have to remember. I will miss collaborating with Paul, but I will always be collaborating with Paul. His way of thinking has influenced my way of thinking. His enthusiasm of the world has become part of my view of the world. And I will always remember when I explain something to try to use the simplest model and remember that it's more complicated than that. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Paul did all of this work here at the Exploratorium, but he also was a world traveler. He had taught in India, he taught in Livingston, Louisiana, he taught all over the world, projects that he was reaching teachers everywhere, really, on the globe. And so I want to bring to the stage Stuart Colhagen to talk about international aspects of Paul's work. Stuart?
A couple of things just before I start. I'd like to thank Eric for inviting me here. I'd like to not thank Eric for saying you'll need to do it in 3 to 5 minutes, so I'll start the clock. I know the Exploratorium very well. Some of the folks at the Exploratorium know me quite well. I've been sort of a ghost that walks through the Exploratorium for the best part of 2.5 decades. I'm from Australia, if the accent doesn't give it away, or perhaps g'day might kind of settle any unresolved questions about where I'm from. I'm based in Canberra. 40 years ago, 4 decades ago, a physics lecturer in Canberra visiting San Francisco came to the Exploratorium, as a physics lecturer is wont to do, and once he was done with it and tired, wanted to leave. But he'd brought his family that were all arts. Sorry, I'll do the Australian thing. Arts students, and his wife, who's an English drama teacher. They weren't ready to go. And he was both impressed and offended at that because he thought he was pretty interesting as telling them about science that was important, and he didn't do it. This did it for them. He returned to Australia and shared this fact with a number of his friends who ultimately got so bored with it, they said, shut up and do something about it. And so he did. And so he and I worked together to establish a small community science centre in Canberra, which within 8 years we had developed our small science centre, we had developed a national, and Australia is the same size as the US, a national outreach program and had secured support from Japan to give us half the money to build our National Science Centre, and we were transformed from an organisation about the size of this theatre into our National Science and Technology Centre. So, well, it's the applause is for the Exploratorium, and a bit of effort, but the trigger for all of that was the model of the Exploratorium. We developed exhibits, we developed outreach. We're probably one of the better organisations in the world as far as that kind of outreach is concerned. Australia's big, it's empty, we do it well. We have to. But during all of that journey, our confidence in what we were doing was backed up by the rock-solid template for how to do things properly was here in the Exploratorium, and we journeyed back here many, many times. During the early years, the main things we were coming here to gain confidence in were our exhibits. And I was part of the group that developed those. So I started as a volunteer, painting signs, cutting out styrofoam, developing shows, developing demonstrations, taking them on the road. And we've developed some fairly good exhibits. We're a good exhibition centre and a good outreach centre. But I always, when I came to the Exploratorium, I would talk with some of the people in the workshop. I would talk with Ned Kahn and Sean Lawney and a range of these people and talk about exhibits. But I would always talk with Paul. And I was always interested and kind of jealous about the work they were doing with teachers, because it wasn't something that we did. We worked with students, we worked with communities, we didn't work with teachers. We, at that stage, kind of felt that teaching was formal education. Science centres were informal education, and we didn't understand how we might bridge that gap. And after a number of years of doing this, I became convinced through those discussions with Paul and the others in the Teacher Institute that no, we actually do have a really solid role as an informal organisation to work with our strengths into the formal education system. And so in the last decade or so, as people in my organisation have died and left, I've been forced to accept positions up the ladder. Again, like Paul, making sure that I was seen to be hopeless at administration, so no one took my time to do that. So I learnt a lot from Paul in that regard. And true, they never gave me any particular administration to look after with that until I became the deputy director in charge of all of the exhibits and the education programs, at which point I was able to push our organisation forward to work formally with teachers. Australia does not have a philanthropic culture compared to America. It's not there. There's only 1 or 2 philanthropic funds. And we, as an organisation, always struggled to attract any of that kind of sponsorship. The moment that we adopted, and I came here and worked with the Teacher Institute 2013, and I might just mention that I took out the inaugural Science Teachers Prize here in the first year that they opened on that. And I think I'm the only non-American to take that honour. So that's a sign that I was simpatico, I guess, with the kind of the teaching at the Exploratorium. The moment our organisation took that step to go, we can and we have a role with teachers, my Science Centre got the largest single philanthropic donation in our country in education. And that's the work of Paul, who's made it clear to us that we do have a valuable role to work with the formal education system. It's not one or the other, it's both of us together. And so as a result of that, we now have an entire new building, which is about working with teachers in informal education. We are now working, yeah. Minute and a half over already. And so Paul and the Teacher Institute that Paul has helped shape has has moved us into that area where we are now working with universities and getting them to understand the formal value in our informal process so that they can now train teachers in a different way. At the end of last year, I was forced, incentivized, given too much money to take a retirement, so I left my deputy director position and became full-time a small teacher institute, just one small teacher institute, taking all of the things which I've learned and the passion that I have for working with teachers out across Southeast Asia. And during just these last, 8 months, I've worked in, I was just doing the sums the other day, 12 countries, 30 different cities, 4 ministries of education, 2,500 teachers, 10,000 students. And every day I do that. And for me, the day started 55 hours ago in Borneo. I got out of bed 55 hours ago in Borneo, did 8 hours of Teacher Institute, Paul-inspired activities, and they loved it and they want more. And everyone around the world that's got their minds on wants more of that. And came here. People like me are people like you who I kind of think of as D1. D1. Does anyone here have heard of the Bacon number? Yeah? The Bacon number? How many degrees of separation you have from bacon in the movies? Not from the smoked meat material. Different bacon, okay? For those of you interested in mathematics, there's an Erdo number. It's how many people have collaborated with Paul Erdo, the Hungarian mathematician. And if you've collaborated with someone that's collaborated with him, you have an Erdo number of 2. Everyone here in this room has a D number, a Doherty number of 1. And picking up the comments that my lovely friends, and hi Linda, have put before, it's, I think, incumbent on us to not only go and share the activities, but share the passion. And all of the speakers tonight have used the same words. It's not only just what he does, but it's the passion that he brings to do it. And it's often easy for other people to copy the activities. It's harder for you to copy the passion. But that's something which, as D1s, Doherty number 1s, we've got a responsibility, because it's up to us now to go and share that with the Doherty 2s on that, and to try and lift the numbers. But I can't even begin to calculate that number of D2s, the number of people that the D1s that have been inspired by Paul have gone on to work with, let alone the 3s. But I know that every science centre, there are 2,000 of them, is aware of the work of the Exploratorium and therefore the work of Paul, and so that the D2s are pretty much everywhere. 2 weeks ago, I increased the number of D2s in the highlands of Papua. They weren't aware of Paul, they are now, and we did a little bit of that in Borneo 55 hours ago. The work continues, and to pick up and sort of finish off, Paul's work hasn't finished, and the teaching that Paul is doing hasn't finished. You have it. And I asked one of the heads of our education, what was the significant thing that you got from your work with Paul? And it was, he showed me the value of paying attention and being interested in everything. And he said, so I'm still learning from Paul. And he's doing that every day. My Patrick is doing that every day. You're doing that every day. That donation continues to go and to carry forward. I struggle, as Eric is nodding over there going, over here, not even looking in that direction, on there. My founding director that I worked with initially boasted that I could talk for 5 minutes on any topic without preparation. He later came back and said, Stuart can't keep to 5 minutes on any topic, no matter the presentation. And that's also true. It takes me a long time to be concise, but I will get there eventually. Perhaps you might see why I ultimately wore them down during the Iron Science teacher. Give it to him and get him off. So to me, in distilling the comments that everyone has said the same thing. To me, I now use this as my guide and my sharing with the teachers that I work with is, if I tell you something, you don't think. If I ask you a question, you might think. If I get you to ask your own questions, you're never stopping thinking. And that's really what Paul gave to us as a gift. So I think that's something to finish up on tonight. So thank you. It's 5 minutes in hexadecimal.
Thanks, Stuart. Well, one of the secrets about the physics community is that there's an inordinately large number of physicists that are mountain climbers. It's actually true if you look statistically. And Paul loved to climb mountains. It was one of his favorite things to do. So to talk about mountain climbing, I'd like to introduce Mike Bolt.
Yeah, so I have to say it's extremely heartwarming to see so many friends and admirers of Paul Doherty here. I count myself as each of those two things, a friend and an admirer. My name is Mike Bolte. I'm a professor of astronomy and astrophysics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Is that better? And like Stuart, I'm going to cut my remarks in half. I think he did that. I'm not sure. So I've known Paul for a very long time. When I was an undergraduate in physics in Florida, there was a professor named Jay Bowman who was a good friend of Paul's through physics. And he would, just like Paul, would get many of his students interested in rock climbing, which if you live in Florida, that meant you drove to North Carolina 14 hours to do that. But we did that a lot. We'd been doing that for some time, and Jay Bowman had this legendary character named Paul Doherty, who he talked about all the time. And Paul was legendary for being super fit, super strong, and super stoked, even though I don't think that we used that word that way in 1965, but that was Paul. So just to get a little bit of context, so if you were a climber learning to climb in 1975 in North Carolina, there was no internet. There were no climbing videos. Even the guidebooks were very rudimentary. They'd say, go to the bent tree and start climbing up. So it was a little, everything you did was exciting. Every time you did a new climb you hadn't done before, it was a kind of a big deal because there were lots of unknowns. And we typically would show up in North Carolina. We'd say, okay, we're finally going to go do that climb we've been planning to for the last 2 trips. We'd get up to the base, we'd look at it. We'd think, well, maybe the weather's going to go bad. I didn't sleep well last night. We'd hem and haw and go do one of our familiar climbs. So the first thing I learned from Paul was the first time I met him. He drove down from Michigan. We met at the North Carolina. It's called Linville Gorge. We did our familiar climbs the first day over the campfire that night. Paul said, okay, tomorrow we're going to go climb Bumblebee Buttress on the fearsome Tennessee Wall, which none of us, we thought that was 3 years away or 4 years away. So we said, great, it's Paul Doherty. So we followed Paul down, we bushwhacked through all the rhododendron. We got to the base, and I think Jay Bowman said, I wonder why they call it Bumblebee Buttress, just as all the bumblebees started coming out of the ground because your footsteps disturbed. But anyway, we got down there, it looked horrible. It was steep, it was overhung. We were all planning our excuses. And Paul put on his harness, tied on the rope, and took off. There was absolutely no hemming and hawing or messing around. And that was the first thing I learned from Paul, was you simply set a goal and you go do it. And you keep ramping your adventures up. If you go too far, you can be hurt, but that was an enormous lesson. 3 years later, I had, I think, the best climbing road trip of my life. Paul and I and 2 of Paul's students spent about 6 weeks. We met at Devil's Tower, and we climbed all through Wyoming and Colorado. And it was more of the same thing. So we didn't do a lot of little climbs. We climbed the Grand Teton. We climbed one of the big walls in Rocky Mountain National Park. A bunch of things that, I was capable of doing, but I never would have without Paul. And again, this was before you could get information easily. So I don't even know how he did all the logistics. He always knew where we had to camp. Did we need an ice axe or not? How do we get to the base of the mountain? How do we get down off the top? Somehow he did all of that stuff, and we spent 6 absolutely fabulous weeks with Paul, because not only was he an excellent climber and an excellent leader, kind of moving us along in our adventure scale, as everybody in this room knows, he was a fabulous person to be with. You might think that after 6 weeks you'd get a little tired of his company, and everybody's shaking their head. That was never true. It was an absolutely wonderful time. I think Paul, we stopped keeping track of how many times Paul said glorious. That was one of his favorite words. It could be the sunset, it could be the sunrise, it could be the last pitch we just climbed. It could be the weather, no matter what the weather was like. Thunderstorms were glorious, beautiful blue sky. It was all glorious. It was a kind of an enthusiasm that really made it wonderful. I think we only had 2 disputes in 6 weeks, and those were both when the young people, not Paul, but the young people insisted that we have a rest day, because Paul was going so hard. So eventually Paul and I both moved out to the West Coast in different places. So most of our climbing trips were shorter, but we made many trips to Yosemite and Tuolumne and Lover's Leap. And as those places got crowded, we'd explore some of the less populated climbing areas in California. There are lots. And it was the same story the whole time. Every time I'd plan something with Paul, he'd say, no, let's not do that climb, let's do this bigger climb. Hal Murray is here. We first climbed the regular route on Fairview together with Paul back, I don't know when, 1980 something. And we did a whole series of nice, big routes that were terrific adventures and terrific times with Paul. So you might wonder if Paul was a good climber. Paul, turns out, was a very good climber. For one thing, he always was extremely fit. I remember one time we met up at Castle Rock up on Skyline Drive to do some bouldering. Paul was about to go to Antarctica, and he said he'd just been in for his physical. Turns out they don't like anybody to go to Antarctica. If you get sick, it's expensive to deal with that. So everybody has to have a physical. And so Paul was on the treadmill. They had to get his heart rate up to 120 in order to do some kind of stress test. And he said they ran up to 2 and 3 and 4. They ran it as fast as it would go, then as steep as it would go, and they only got his heart rate up to 80. So they finally just said, we guess you're good to go. So he was extremely fit. He was also, he was a physicist, of course, and he thought a lot about that as he climbed, and it made him a better climber. He understood friction, he understood, vector forces, he understood a lot about moments and balance. And I have just one short story. So one time Paul, a friend of mine named Bill Fry, who at the time was a guide for the Yosemite Mountaineering School. So this is kind of the elite of the elite climbers in the world. We were going to go do a climb on Lambert Dome. It was pretty hard. I led the first pitch. Bill led the second. We got to the third pitch. I went up, couldn't figure it out, came down, handed the rope to Bill. Bill went up. Couldn't figure it out, came down. Paul said, I think I see how to do this. So we said, okay, we'll give the rope to the old guy, because he was a little bit older. And, Paul went up, found a little place to put a piece of protection, put his thumb over here and hung one leg way off to the left as a counterbalance that would never occur to anybody. Got right past that move and was up. Bill looked at me with his eyes wide and his eyebrows up and said, I'm going to do it that way too. So, he's a wonderful guy. I'm really going to I do miss Paul. I miss his enthusiasm and optimism for life. I have a PhD in astronomy and another one in physics, but he was always my go-to guy for physics problems. I miss that we have many, many great memories that we won't be able to share together anymore. But I think I have 2 main lessons. I've thought about it as I've prepared for this talk that I got from Paul that I hope I pay attention to for the rest of my life. The first one is that first word I used, be stoked. Paul was just so enthusiastic about everything. It made it wonderful to do things with him, wonderful to be around him. It just made the world better. And I think the other one is a phrase from George Emery Hale. It's a guy who built some of the early telescopes, the Palomar 200-inch. He had a great phrase which fit Paul perfectly, which was, "Make no small plans." And I love that my plans all got ramped up with Paul. So thank you very much.
So one of the great things about Paul was getting to work with him and see him work with so many people, so many colleagues. And we've talked about teaching, we've talked about his mountain climbing. One of the great partnerships that Paul had was with our next speaker, which is John Cassidy, and their work on books for Klutz Press. So John.
Well, this is great because I'm normally accustomed to talking to people about Paul who don't know Paul. And so now there'll be a lot of inside jokes that you'll share. Rob just stole my first line. I'm John Cassidy. He was correct. I think I'm Paul's connection to the for-profit commercial world. I'm the publisher of Klutz Books and Paul's publisher. I first met Paul in 1988. Pat Murphy and Kirk Gabrielson came down to Palo Alto, and the four of us talked about a project that I'd pitched to the museum, the Explore book, which we managed to launch. And the four of us got ourselves all excited by the idea, and soon we had a team. Paul Doherty, I was told, was going to be, this new guy, Paul Doherty, was going to be my editorial contact. He was going to be in charge, I was going to be in charge of all the wrong questions, and he would be in charge of all the right answers. And that was a relationship that worked for me, and it began a collaboration that lasted for 30 years, and I describe as the most important of my career. Paul was the first guy I ever met who used the word sensational in ordinary conversation. Sensational was one of the words that you read, I'd always thought, and never said. But Paul used it in conversation. He said it all the time. The Michelson-Morley experiment was sensational. The Bernoulli effect was sensational. Gravity was sensational. As you listened to him, you got all excited. You wanted to believe him. You wanted to live in Paul's world. It was sensational. Paul and I did dozens of books together, and Paul was the science and the brains behind every one. I became his longest-running student, and the people around me eventually came to know that if I ever said anything interesting or accurate, I probably got it from Paul. My experience was far from unique. Thanks to the millions of sales and enormous popularity of all of his books, I doubt there's a more popular or important scientist in all of kids' literature. The most recent book Paul did was with my son Cody. The Cassidy-Doherty partnership has become multi-generational. And once you count it all up, nobody has reached a larger audience and nobody has left a bigger footprint. I have the reports from our marketing department to back me up on this. The kids that have been inspired by Paul's books, by his energy and enthusiasm, will grow to be tomorrow's scientists and teachers. And behind them will come another wave, and another wave, and another wave. All of them Paul Doherty-inspired teachers and scientists. Paul and Ellen and Nan and I must have gone to about 50 nonprofit gala dinners over the years. And I remember at one of them, Nan looked at me and said, "You know, I think Paul's been wearing that same brown sweater since the first dinner 20 years ago. You know him? Do you know that sweater? Is that possible?" I explained that many things about Paul were hard to believe. For example, I'd been working with Paul for many years when something began to nag at me. There was something a little different about Paul. At the end of one meeting, I finally realized what it was. It was so unique, I had to coin a word for it. "Paul," I said, "you're a mono mood. You're always excited. You're always positive. It's like your sweater. How do you do that? When our kids were growing up and they'd ask all those difficult why questions that kids always ask, I was always very proud and happy to have an answer. I don't know, I'd say. I'll ask Paul. And I'd shoot a note off to Paul. Sending all these why is the sky blue questions started when the kids were young, but as the years passed, there were always more questions, and Paul became embedded in our family life. He was like an expression around the Cassidy household. I don't know, we'd all say, ask Paul. And sometimes there'd be other people in the room and they'd be confused and they'd say, who's Paul? But now he's gone. Paul D. at exploratorium.edu. And for a while, I stopped because it reminded me. But old habits aren't easy to lose. And Paul kept coming up, and then something funny happened. I stopped trying to stop. And it stopped hurting like it had. And now we're right back to saying it like we always did. Now, of course, I have to look up the damn answer and figure it out for myself. And it's never as clear or as funny as Paul would have made it. But that's never going to happen. And I can't fix that. But Paul's back in our lives again, and that makes me really happy. And now when I say, I'll have to ask Paul, and there are people in the room who say, who's Paul? I get to tell them. I tell them he was an important scientist, a great friend, and a sensational human being.
So, thanks, John, for that. The next speaker has the title of Teacher Institute Director, had for a number of years, Julie Yu, who worked with him more recently. So, Julie, can you tell us more about Paul?
Don't worry, folks. I'm a teacher, so I'm always aware of the bell. Hi, friends. I first met Paul when I was a participant in the Teacher Institute, which is now almost 20 years ago. And so I'm here to represent all of the teachers who benefited so much from Paul's generosity in sharing his knowledge about science and teaching with us. It is so lovely to see so many of you here tonight. Paul was a true supporter of teachers, and he did it in a very respectful way that validated their experience and expertise. And that's a mentality that unfortunately is all too rare among scientists. So I guess I'm also here to represent the scientists for whom Paul serves as a wonderful and important model. I've had countless conversations about science with Paul over the years, dating back to an argument we had about thermodynamics when I was still in grad school, actually. Yet the most important lessons I learned from Paul were actually about people. When I became director of TI, his one piece of advice to me was to make sure to always get all sides of a story when conflict would inevitably arise, because he knew that data collection would serve me better than emotional intuition, and he was right. One of my greatest memories of Paul happened in not a great place. We were standing in the dirty storage room, the TI storage closet at the PFA. There's laughter because these people have endured time in there. And I shouldn't say that. It was a wonderful place. Many wonderful things happened there, and numerous rats called it home. Anyway, I don't remember what we were doing, but I remarked to Paul that he appeared to never get angry at anyone. And I asked him if that could truly be the case. And he told me that he'd been the only redheaded kid in his elementary school, and he'd been picked on a lot. And he'd learned to suppress his emotions and not show his anger. But over time, he realized that that was not going to serve him in the long run. And he told me that he finally got to a point where whenever someone would do something that would upset him, he would simply think to himself, they'll do better next time. And he truly believed it. Paul remains one of the most positive people I have ever known. And I cannot tell you how often, when something doesn't go quite right, I hear his voice inside my head. They'll do better next time. I also want to celebrate Patio. I've been so delighted to see her transformation these last number of years, and so honored to have been led gradually deeper into her life. And as much as I enjoyed Tuesday afternoon conversations about science with Paul, I will treasure conversations with Patio in our office late on a Thursday night about inclusion and acceptance. A long time ago, Paul told me that the secret of the Exploratorium is the people. And then he smiled, that confident smile that he had when he knew he was right about something. And I know you know the smile I'm talking about because he had it often. And over the years, I realized that the secret of Paul was his unique perspective on people. And despite all that I learned about science and teaching from him, the lessons I'll remember from Paul and Patio are the ones about the beauty of the human spirit. And so on behalf of my entire Teacher Institute family, all of the teachers and staff, past and present, I want to say how grateful we are to have been able to walk this world for a bit with Paul. And because of him, we'll do even better next time. He will be missed. Thank you.
So thanks, Julie. My role is to talk about Paul, the television star. Now, if you would look at Paul and look at his what he dressed, his hair, you might say, this guy will not be a television star. But in fact, he was. Some of you may remember the time when David Letterman did a show out here in San Francisco at the Palace of Fine Arts. They always wanted to have a science person there. Someone brings furry animals or something. So they say, who do you got? We said, we have Paul. And Paul got on there, had a great time talking to David Letterman, did the show. And he got on the show and did the work, and he had the great Van de Graaff generator exhibit. And he had talked with David about this before. He's doing it. We're going to do this. I'm fine. So he actually then touched David Letterman, who got this enormous shock. Now, and he looked really startled. David Letterman looked like, I can't believe I just got shocked on television. And actually, I often wondered whether David Letterman knew that was going to happen or not. I never knew the full story. But what I did know is that they called the next week and said, we'd like Paul to come to New York every month and be on the David Letterman show. To which Paul said, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm out here in California teaching teachers. That's my life. I don't want to be a television star. And can you imagine the opportunity that would have been, and yet for him to say where he wanted to be? He wanted to be out here with you guys. So the amazing thing about being Paul in television was many of the programs he did, you've seen a lot of films, but doing the solar eclipse was one of his favorite gigs. He did probably, I think he was engaged with 6 or 7 of them. I think he went live to about 5 of the broadcasts. We did live broadcasts. I got the wonderful time of going on a broadcast with him 3 places, to Turkey, to the Gobi Desert in China, and to a small atoll in Micronesia. And going on these trips was one of the most incredibly wonderful experiences of my life. Because, of course, Paul was curious about everything. And you just asked him everything. He pointed out everything where we were. He was so enthusiastic. He had the stamina of an ox to go out there and do this in the middle of the hot desert or in the cold. It was just an incredible experience. And what I realized when I watched them on television, watched them on video, that of course he was a movie star. He had this ability to project in such an enthusiastic way through the camera into the screen that was unbelievable. It didn't matter that he had his khaki pants and he had his funny belt and he had not a sweater but the same shirt. It didn't matter. He just projected through the screen in the most amazing way. And that's what I remember about Paul. It's not about the way you look, it's about the way you are, the way you experience a dynamism. He just had a way of infecting teaching in an extraordinary way. It's something that I think we all loved and I love to model from. It was really amazing to sort of be in the field with Paul and have that experience, a very rich experience for me. I got fortunate to know him for the entire time he was here for 31 years. He's a key player for the Exploratorium. He's been our core. And as everyone has said already, we're going to miss him, but he's with all of us, and he's going to keep this place going forward. So we're so happy that he has been with us, and I think, as we said at the beginning, it was a life well lived. So now I'd like to introduce Ellen Hansen, who wants to make some remarks. Ellen?
So you knew Paul Doherty, Dr. Doherty, Herr Professor Doherty, and we would go places and he would get introduced like that. Well, I'm Mrs. all of that. 42 years worth of Mrs. All That. And what I'm finding is it's changed from MRS, period, to, it's the only place I'm ever called Mrs., was Mrs. All That, to MISSES, all that. And we're all getting used to that, missing Paul. So what I want to start with is some thank yous. I want to thank you all, each and every one of you, for being here this evening. It really means a lot to me that you're here, and I can feel the love and connection that you have for Paul. I also want to thank the Exploratorium and all of those who created tonight's celebration. I know that it involved a lot of planning. You were very gracious in including me. A lot of work. And at the same time that you did it, you also were dealing with your own loss of Paul. I also want to thank those who got the scholarship fund set up, and to those who have already donated to it. On the back of your little cards, it tells how to find it if you haven't heard about it yet. And I really appreciate all of the help in honoring Paul and spreading the work, getting that D1 to be D2 to D3 to D4 that Stuart talked about. All of that work in the world gets spread further by it. And this brings me to a special thank you to the Exploratorium itself. For 31 years, the institution and the people who are the Exploratorium supported Paul and sent him out into a larger and larger sphere of influence. Yes, he was talented. Yes, he was creative. Yes, he was almost driven to share his knowledge, his enthusiasm and his curiosity about the world and how it worked. However, the Exploratorium encouraged all that, and over time, it became a vehicle which Paul rode around the world sharing his gifts. And to me, the Exploratorium deserves a huge thank you for that. I also want to thank all of the previous speakers for your remembrances of Paul. As is so often true, when I hear about him from others, I find myself wanting to know more about this person who's being spoken about, even after 42 years. What a man he was. In our early years together, I often went to Paul's lectures, and I'd get caught up on his talk. Yes, I knew the person up there was my husband. I understood that. But he was such an engaging speaker. I'd get caught up in his talk, and I'd ask questions. And later, when people found out that I was Mrs. All That, they'd decide that he must have given me a list of questions, and put me in the audience so that he could speak to them. Not the case at all. And sometimes it would be, you said this over here and you said that over there, and I don't see how they can relate. And he'd go, huh, You know, she's right. And then he'd make it work for them. And it was fun. A close cousin of Paul's said of him, with Paul growing up in several out-of-state locations, it was always exciting when he came home to Boston. In the picture of the two of us with the globe, where the pictures are, you'll see two little kids with a globe. You can see how happy I was simply being around Paul. I expect that most of you here know exactly what Cousin George meant. And I believe that this came from Paul's having one of the greatest qualities of life that a person can have, the ability to enjoy life every day. Now, I'm a fairly private person, and my friends can stop snickering, but I shared in the private life of a man who had an extremely public life, both out in the physical world and in cyberspace. We were lucky that early on we succeeded in creating a marriage where we came together as a couple and we continued to be two individuals. Our intent for our home life was to have it be a nest where we could come together, a place where we could renew, refresh, and recharge, and from there, go out into the world, be it separately or together. And it's from that place of the more private Paul that I'd like to bring you a few glimpses by sharing a few of our code words. You may recognize how from these glimpses, how from the nest that we made translated into his larger worldly global self. Now, I want to back up for a minute. Code words. Anybody who's got a really, really close friend or a sweetheart or whatever, you know those ways that couples communicate privately with each other frequently when they're in the midst of other people? I figure it's okay to tell you some of them now because we're not ever going to use them again. The first one is mostly. Paul told such good stories, didn't he? You know, that was the Irish in him. He had the knack of taking 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 perfectly fine events, sifting out the pieces which got in the way of a good tale, and weaving the rest into a single story. Now, I admit, it drove me crazy. The end result was a good story. However, you know, he'd tell it as though it were true, but he moved things around, and it could be that he talked about spring and it was really fall, or that some of the people were only here, but he hadn't been through the whole thing, and I'd been there, and I knew that he was changing it around, and it drove me crazy. Now, what I'm talking about here were always things which had involved both of us. It wasn't all of it. It was just the things where it was stories about both of us. And it took us a while, but we did develop a way that he could tell a story in his own way, and I wouldn't sit there cringing. And you know what it's like to tell a story when somebody who's in the story is sitting there sort of going, ah. Well, I didn't want to do that, and he didn't want me to do that, and he didn't want to change how he told stories, so at the end, I had the possibility of saying, mostly, and I could say it really positively. That let him know that I'd certainly tell it differently. The funny thing is that the use of that single word shifted things from any sense of correct versus false to simply being different ways of presenting material. I know that sometimes it was a case where he just stored all of the 3 or 4 memories in the same place in his head, and he really thought that the resulting weave was a single event which happened. Other times, he did pick and choose much more consciously, simply for a better-to-him tale. As Mark Twain is actually erroneously quoted, having said, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story." So imagine my surprise some, 10, 15, 20 years into our marriage when I was telling an anecdote. He was mostly the storyteller, but I was telling an anecdote about us. And at the end, he smiled and said very quietly, mostly. And that gave both of us a good laugh. And after that, we found we used it back and forth with each other. And it was a very sweet thing. The next phrase is a good start. Now, Paul and I both appreciated massage, and this is where that phrase started. And we'd trade rubs back and forth, back rubs, foot rubs, hand rubs, head rubs, shoulder rubs, you name it. In fact, on special occasions, any of those gift-giving holidays, one of the things that we would do is we'd make our own little coupons, handwritten in the days before computers could make fancy graphics. And oh, goody, this year I got 10 coupons for, maybe back or foot or whatever. And sometimes it could be that it wasn't for a specific thing, it was for a specific amount of time. That was a nice present, too. Now, in the early years, my body could happily use all the coupons up in one sitting, if Paul let me, which he didn't. So rather than me, at the end of a coupon time, 10, half an hour maybe even, I learned that saying that, wait, you're not stopping, are you? What? You aren't going, you're going? You're done? No. That however much time he'd lovingly spent hearing that, it isn't really conducive to give or to get further rubs. So we ended up with the phrase of, at the end of whatever time, regardless of whether my or his body was screaming, that was a good start. Now, we both knew that the person who said that really meant, my body's really tired and tight, that even this generous, wonderful, marvelous half hour of great massage seemed like about 2 seconds, and I can't believe you're done. I'm grateful for what you did, and please don't take my whimpering personally. Maybe you're just taking a little break, because sometimes he actually would do that, and then he'd come back. We both used the phrase. That was a good start. Can be heard and was heard as appreciation with an implied openness for more rather than a complaint. And it made a huge difference in the number of rubs that either of us gave or got. The next phrase is, it's an adventure. I'm sure many of you have heard this one. Whether you're my friends or Paul's, whether you worked with him or just knew him. It's an adventure started when we were first together and we saw lots of our friends around us going on outings and ending up with disasters. We didn't want FUBARs in our life. So we had developed the idea of having an adventure instead. And it is really simple. When you're having an adventure, you're in the right place, at the right time, with the right people, under the right circumstances. Copy it. Take it into your lives. You can say it's an adventure to yourself or to your companions before you leave the house, before you leave the driveway, before they close the plane doors if you haven't done it before the vacation begins, before you start a project. You'll be surprised. It actually will change your life. I believe for Paul, this came from his ability to enjoy life every day. It's a practice, one which you can cultivate. Now, in my world, the way this is phrased is when you first wake, fill yourself with joy and aliveness for no reason at all. And the more you do this, the more you'll find that pretty much all of life not only can be called an adventure, it is. And then there's a word that you might or might not have associated with Paul, boredom. So when we were first together, we'd go out for dinner. Now, when I go out for dinner, I check the menu. from soup to nuts. And I figure out, okay, I'll have a little less of that so that I can have some of this. Or I like dessert. Okay, I could split that with him, and then I'll have dessert. And I plan it. And at that point, I planned it fairly a lot. Now, Paul, we're sitting with the menu. At that time, he played a really good game. It sounded like he would do the same thing. Only invariably, partway through his eating, dessert wasn't in his sights. For whatever reason, I found, certainly at the time, I got used to it over time, but I find going out to dinner and eating dessert by myself less than interesting, especially when he just sat there. And I'd be really disappointed at the time, especially because he usually sat there drumming his fingers on the table while I ate whatever confection I had. So one time I was a little mad and I screwed up my courage, and it wasn't on the way home, fortunately. And I mentioned that, I'd really do better if you simply told me that you were bored, and I'd be willing to skip dessert. He had no idea what I meant. None. Well, you're sitting there drumming your fingers and you're just wanting me to finish. We don't go out all that often, and I kind of like to sit and enjoy my dessert and have some conversation, and you're sitting there drumming. And he's, what do you mean? I'm not bored. Why would you think that? Well, you're sitting there drumming your fingers, and what else am I supposed to think? And he was really confused. Why would you think that drumming my fingers means boredom? Well, everybody knows that. Is there anybody else here who actually knows that? That if somebody's sitting there, there's at least one person. Good, I don't feel totally alone. He'd never heard of it. Really, he had never heard of it. It was simply all the excess energy that he had was, he was sitting in a public place. It was just the energy coming out. So two things for us came out of that conversation. One, he agreed to drum his fingers on his knee out of sight. And eventually he also agreed not to hit the table when he was doing it, because that confused me. And the other thing was, and it took me a number of years before I really got this, he began to convince me that he never got bored. He grasped the concept intellectually. However, I truly believe that he never experienced it himself. And he didn't truly understand how anyone could be bored. There was always something to think about or watch or investigate. And this was even true in his final symptoms. He had vertigo and double vision in that last 5 weeks. He was in bed most of the time, not reading, not being online because of the vertigo and the double vision. He did listen to a long audiobook and loved it, Ken Burns' The National Parks. And I read aloud a book that we'd started already, and he was interested in hearing the rest. But there really were many hours when he was simply awake in bed. And at one point, I thought to ask him if maybe he was finally exploring boredom. I was just curious. He gave me such a funny look and said, no. And I said, okay, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm writing my next science fiction story. And Pat, he was on the second version, the second draft of it. And I wish I'd asked him about it, but things moved on and it's gone. It was said of Voltaire by his biographer, and I believe this to be true of Paul. First and above all else, he was marvelously alive. And mankind, who dread boredom even more than anxiety, is eternally grateful to those who make life throb to a swifter, stronger beat. Before Paul had surgery last March, he had to sign those pre-surgery papers. And there was a little line in there that mentioned that as a possible outcome of this 5-6 hour procedure, he might die. And he told a few of us something that I want to leave with you. And to each of you that he told, who have reiterated it to me and reminded me of it, I am very grateful. What he said was, if I do die as a result of this procedure, know I've had a good life. I have no regrets. No lists of I should have or I shouldn't have. No wished otherwise. I do have a list of things I look forward to in the future. However, I have no regrets. I've had great love, great work, great friends, and grand adventures. I've traveled extensively. I've done everything I wanted to do. I've explored the world, and I've been able to share the results. I've had a great life. And that life was an adventure of a marvelously alive man who had the ability to enjoy life every day. A man whose knowledge, enthusiasm, and curiosity made you happy simply to be around him. That you got infected or infused with any of those qualities was a wonderful side effect of what we joined together tonight to celebrate. A life well lived. So I thank you for coming. I thank you for being here. And most of all, I thank you for loving Paul.
So as many of you know, Paul loved to work with artists, and that was, he met Sarah Hopkins, who was an artist in residence here, who together with Paul learned and played the whirly. And I think we have some whirlies here to distribute.
Hi. Is Stuart here? My name is Eric Muller. I worked with Paul for about 22 years. I was a rafting partner, hiking partner, backpacking partner, river rafting partner, office mate. He hired me. He was my boss. Some ties. Stuart, I'm going to throw down the gauntlet, 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'm done. Okay? So, I want to end the evening with something that I think Paul would approve of, which would be a hands-on, or more to the point, a lips-on activity. So as you know, Paul, or maybe you didn't know, but Paul really loved corrugated tubes. And if some people on the side over there can pass those bowls out, inside you'll find a little corrugated tube. But do me a favor, here's the teacher and me, don't do anything with them yet. So just grab one, hold on to it, okay? So I'll tell you a story while you are getting one of those corrugated tubes. So if you have never seen Paul play a corrugated tube, he was a maestro at it. He played medium-sized tubes, and he played large tubes, but I never saw him play a little tube, at least at the beginning. So I was at a convenience store, and I was drinking a soda, very, very large soda, that had a flexible straw. And I pulled the straw out from the container, and I looked at it, looked at its properties, and I made a guess as to what might happen, and I played it. I got really excited. And so I was thinking, who do I know who had a great sense of wonder and who had a great sense of humor? Who do you think that would be? Paul Doherty. So I rushed over to Paul after I was done drinking my drink, and I showed him what I found out about this small little corrugated straw, and I was telling him everything about it, and then from underneath his desk, he pulled out his small corrugated straw. And so we were in the office, both playing our straw. So we wanted to end today with an activity for you to leave with. Don't blow it yet, don't blow it yet. So I wanted to have a salute to Paul with a toot from these little small corrugated straws. And just to let you know, something that will make Paul proud. Oh, actually, Tommy, can I have that? When we got the shipment in yesterday, just-in-time delivery, which would also make Paul proud, they came like this. They were, they actually have two different types of corrugations on that. And we did an investigation, Zeke and I, and we realized that actually cutting them down would make them sound better. So you have the top portion of these. So in a second, don't do it yet, don't do it yet. In a second, we're gonna blow our salute and toot to Paul, but this is what I want you to do when you leave here. I want you to take your small little whirly, and to honor Paul, I want you to make some more discoveries about your little whirly when you leave here tonight, okay? So you ready? You can figure it out. I will say this, it is not that complicated. You ready? 1, 2, 3. And we are done.
So thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the Exploratorium. Thank you very much.